you. First, however, I would like to draw your attention to this beautiful altar that was done by Gailya. And isn't that just fabulous? Gailya always... Gailya never knows what the colors are going to be until she goes to the flower mart. So that's so fabulous. So our speaker is going to be talking about change. And so that butterfly is the symbol of transformation. So that's in all of our futures to transform. Our speaker today is not a stranger to the Golden Gate Center for Spiritual Living. I'm so happy to welcome back Mike Robbins. He is an author, a teacher, a speaker who delivers keynotes and seminars for groups of all kinds. He is the author of 3 books, Focus on the Good Stuff, Be Yourself, Everyone Else is Already Taken, and his latest, which is this one, Nothing Changes Until You Do. Mike and his work have been featured on ABC News, the Oprah Radio Network, and others. He is a regular contributor to Huffington Post, and his books have been translated into 14 different languages. He may be the most famous person that we have speak here. Mike and his family live right here in Marin as well. So it is my absolute joy to welcome back our friend, Mike Robbins.
All right, how many of you have any people in your life or any circumstances that you would like to change? Most of us do, right? So I was talking to my spiritual counselor, Eleanor, a few years ago. And, you know, she and I have been working together for a few years and working on some different things that I want to change and whatnot. And she says to me at one point during one of our sessions, something really simple but profound to me. She said, Mike, you keep trying to change a bunch of people and a bunch of circumstances and situations in your life, thinking that if those change, then you'll change. She said, it doesn't work that way. It's the other way around. She said, nothing changes until you do. And it wasn't like I'd never heard that before, at least that concept, right? I mean, we talk about that a lot here, but there was something about her saying that just at that moment and that point in my life, and it really struck me. And it actually inspired the title of my most recent book. But it's more than just the title of a book. It's really a way to look at life and a way for us to orient ourselves into the world. So that's what I'm going to talk about this morning, is the internal change, right? That's why we come here. But in some ways, if we're really honest, our little ego shows up sometimes and we want to change other people. Or we're trying to manipulate the circumstances or the situations or whatever, and we think if that happens, then I'll change. Then life will be how I want it to be, right? So I'm going to focus on 2 or 3 things. First, talk a little bit about some of the relationships that we have, and particularly the ones that are the most difficult or challenging. Then we'll talk a little bit about our relationship with ourselves. And then maybe sprinkle in a little bit about vulnerability. How's that sound? Okay. So think of someone in your life right now that you're frustrated with. You got anybody like that? You know, and the interesting thing about it is one of the things that we can do to really shift our relationships, but it really starts with us, is to let go of our self-righteousness. Self-righteousness. What do I mean by that? How many of you, like me, have a lot of opinions? And how many of you, like me, think your opinions are right? Yeah, that's the problem. Nothing wrong with your opinions. Have as many opinions as you want. Be as passionate about them as you want. The issue isn't with our opinions. It's the righteousness with which we hold the opinion. And that can show up in a lot of different ways. Right? I think about this. My mother taught me a lot about this. Now, my mom passed away a few years ago. But my mom was a very interesting woman. And one of the many things that I learned from my mother was I learned how to hold a grudge. I come from a long line of grudge holders, right? It was like, you mess with us, you're in trouble, right? Because it was like that was part of, so maybe some of you can relate to this. So good, you know. But one of the many things that I learned from my mother, that when my mother got sick and ultimately, you know, knew that the end was coming, as painful and difficult as that was, and it was painful, and it was difficult, and any of us who've been through that experience with people close to us, you know, but there's also often when someone is going through that process, there's so much beauty that shows up, right? There's so much wisdom that comes. And as my mom was dying, there were some amazing things that were happening. She sort of surrendered to the process in this way and was just so full of life and so full of passion, even as her body was starting to deteriorate. And she called me up one day, and this was sort of classic of the last month or two before she died, and she calls me on the phone and she says, Mike, I just had the most amazing conversation with Jeannie. I said, Jeannie? She said, yeah. Now, Jeannie's the next door neighbor. I said, really, Mom? She said, do you know that she has not been in this house since 1979? I said, I know, Mom, because you hate her. And she says, oh, that's ridiculous. And then she goes on to tell me about this amazing conversation that she and Jeannie had for an hour and a half in my mother's living room. And I was just, like, struck by that. Because in that moment, and given what my mom was facing, it was kind of like, well, whatever, who cares? Yeah, we've had our issues and our problems, but, like, present in the moment, right? And the thing about it is, look, we don't have to be dying to let go of a resentment or a grudge. Right? I mean, you've all heard the saying, and I love the saying, and I try to remind myself of this too when I get upset or frustrated or find myself holding a grudge. Right? You've heard it, right? Holding a grudge is like what? Drinking poison, expecting the other person to die. But that's what we do. And it's sneaky. It's tricky. Right? We got to be mindful of this. Martin Luther King said this beautiful thing. He said many beautiful things, but he said, we have no morally persuasive power with those who can feel our underlying contempt for them. We have no morally persuasive power with those who can feel our underlying contempt for them. You know, this last week has been a pretty amazing week here in America, right? A lot of change, a lot going on, a lot happening politically. And for many of us, particularly if we're of a particular political persuasion here in the Bay Area, there were some good things that happened, right? And some genuinely good things. But as I was so excited myself, and I'm looking around, I'm watching posts on Facebook and things, and everyone's hashtag love wins, and we've all got our rainbow flags. What was interesting to me, as excited as I was, I started to think to myself, now look, if we're going to get really excited about the fact that love wins, and that this thing happened that many of us may agree is the right thing, which I personally do, love winning is really about loving everybody. Can we love the people who disagree with us on really fundamental, important issues? Can we accept people who look at the world and see it very differently than we do? Or is it just like our team wins and then we all get to cheer? Right? Because sadly, I think a lot of our politics have turned into my team and your team. It's like the Giants and the Dodgers. It's not really like what we believe in. Or maybe it is, but then my beliefs, if you don't believe the same thing I believe, particularly on certain really, really passionate things, I don't want to talk to you. That's self-righteousness. Look, here's the thing about self-righteousness, and it's not a moral thing. This isn't like good or bad. It's like self-righteousness separates us from other people. It separates us from our heart. It separates us from God. That's what happens. So when we're in that self-righteous place, the tricky part is, can I keep my heart open when I disagree with someone? And not just politically, but again, personally. So you're my friend, you're my spouse, you're my child, you're someone close to me, and you've upset me or hurt my feelings. Can I keep my heart open? You know, Dr. King also talked about the different levels and sort of stages of love. You know, there's love of friends, community, right? There's love of someone we're in love with, our romantic partner. But then he talked a lot about agape, which is unconditional love. That means loving people you don't even like. That's a spiritual practice, right? We don't necessarily have to be friends with or hang out with, but we interact with people, and sometimes we're forced to be with, based on family or work situations, people we don't particularly like that much. And what a great opportunity to practice love. It's easy to do it when we come here and we're all like-minded and we say the same affirmations and we believe a lot of the same things, but the question then becomes, can we do that out in the world? Easier said than done. So as excited as I am personally about some of the things that we've seen happen and some of the amazing changes, I do think that, you know, Friday's decision, for what it's worth, as we step back, it's like, wow, for all of our frustrations and times and things could be better and we should be more progress and all of that, we can step back and go, wow, things do actually change. We've seen something pretty dramatic change over the course of time. And in some cases, maybe it could happen faster and better and there's more to happen, but in other cases, wow. But the other thing is, on a personal level, can we really live in that place of love and acceptance, regardless of what other people believe or think? Does that make sense? And it's a constant practice to notice when and where and why and how we get self-righteous and to remove it. I was speaking at an event. I talk a lot about self-righteousness in the context a lot of times of authenticity. And I was speaking at a corporate event down in LA a couple months ago. And I spoke and I was talking about how self-righteousness often gets in our way. We want to have an impact. We want to influence people. We want to create change. But us being self-righteous makes it difficult. And this woman came up to me after my speech and she said, you know, I had never really thought about the whole self-righteousness thing. She said, but I'm the oldest of 4, and my father passed away a few years ago. My mother's getting older now, and we're all trying to care for her and support her. And she said, I'm the oldest, so I've been sort of taking some of the lead on it and trying to help my mom. And she said, but my mom drives me crazy. She doesn't listen to me. She doesn't listen to my ideas. She's constantly, right? And as she's telling me this whole thing, and I could have as much empathy and awareness and understanding, I could feel she started to cry, and she said, I never thought, maybe one of the reasons why she doesn't listen to me is because I'm so self-righteous with her. Because I really think if she'd just listen to me, things would be better for her, but she doesn't, and we end up fighting, and I can't stand it. And I said to her, look, I could tell. I said, I can tell how much you love your mother, obviously. I said, but you could just let her know. You could let her know how you really feel, that you're scared, and you're sorry, and you just want to try to help. Have that conversation instead of telling her what to do. But where do we do that in life? And sometimes we're blind to it because we really think, no, they need to listen to me. And maybe they do, but they can't hear you because the righteousness is getting in the way. Does that make sense? All right. So that has to do with us paying attention to that, our relationships. Let's talk a little bit, though, about our relationship with ourselves. So my friend Karen Drucker is here today. You guys know Karen and Karen's wonderful, beautiful music and all of her wisdom. And I have so many favorite Karen Drucker songs, but one of my absolute favorites is called Be Gentle with Yourself. Right? And the lyric is, I will be gentle with myself. I will hold myself like a newborn baby child. How many of us hold ourselves that way? Not usually, right? You know, one of the things that we can do actually to start being more gentle with ourselves is actually not take ourselves so seriously. Any of you find yourself ever taking yourself seriously? Sometimes I jokingly but seriously will say to my wife, Michelle, hey, do you have any idea how important I think I am? Right? Because we take ourselves really seriously. But one of the things is to be able to actually laugh at ourselves lovingly, not in a mean way. But it's my daughter Samantha came with me today. She's 9. And as we were driving over here, we were talking about and thinking about the last time she came with me here. I've had the honor of speaking here a number of times. I appreciate you guys inviting me. But 5 years ago on Father's Day, so it was almost exactly 5 years ago because we just had Father's Day last weekend, right? I was here. And I got invited to speak, and I spoke about fatherhood and Father's Day. And the plan when we woke up that morning was the whole family, my wife, Michelle, Samantha, who was 4 at the time, and her little baby sister, who was a year and a half, Rosie. We were all going to come. I was going to speak. We were actually living in the East Bay at the time. And then I'd speak at the church, and then we were going to go up to Sonoma and spend Father's Day. And woke up. Rosie wasn't feeling well, our 18-month-old at the time. She was sick. So I said to Michelle, don't worry. I'll drive over to the church. I'll speak. I'll come back. We'll just hang out by the house. No big deal. But Samantha, who was 4 at the time, knew we were getting up to go to church, and Daddy was speaking, and she was like, I'm coming. But she was 4, right? And at that point, it wasn't like, okay. And so we kind of negotiated. Why don't you stay home with no, okay, fine. Okay, you're going to come. But here's the thing. We come, they have church and the kids, and we'll go with the kids, right? When we get here, I brought some coloring for her and everything, and I don't want to go with the kids. I want to hear you talk. Okay, are you sure you got to sit like by yourself? And like, you're going to be okay? Yeah, okay, fine. So I'm a little nervous about it, but excited. And then, you know, the church used to be the other. So I was standing over there, and she was sitting over there, and I'm speaking, and I'm talking, and my little 4-year-old isn't that sweet, and right? And then at one point, and she was great, and some of you may remember this, right? And at one point, she said, sort of stop coloring, and I'm getting close towards the end of my talk, and she sort of raised her hand. And I said, honey, would you like to say something? And she said, no, I'm just wanting to know when you're going to be done. To, of course, everybody, if you were here that day, you remember, everybody laughed, and I went, well, I guess I'm done now, right? And I got off. But it was such a great moment, and we, that story, because it was just like I had to be able to laugh at myself, right? But just to be able to laugh and not take ourselves too seriously. We get so caught up in whatever, and especially when things are stressful or challenging or there's serious stuff going on, is there a way for us to keep it a little bit light? Not take it so seriously. And it's important that we have people around us who can remind us of that. Right? Because many of us, look, you know this. You come to this church. You do this work. You've been on your spiritual path for many, many years. I'm not saying stuff that you don't know, but just because we know it doesn't mean we always practice it, right? Many of us can tell other people stuff, right? You guys do it to each other all the time. Sometimes I used to have a friend, we used to joke with each other, and we should say, you know what, I'm going to start doing this. He was a speaker like me. I'm going to stand up and say, hey, take my advice. I'm not using it, right? Because it's easy to tell other people, right? But sometimes we got to start to pay attention, and it's nice, but from time to time, again, we have to have people around us lovingly who can kind of give us a little feedback and point out. And, Michelle, my wife, has been that for me for a number of years. I mean, we've been together for 15 years now. But I remember one conversation that we had many, many years ago. This was, we had started dating. We'd probably been together for about 6 months. Me meeting Michelle and me starting my business, at the time coaching and then doing some speaking and wanting to write and do the work that I do now. Michelle was a big inspiration in that. I wanted to do it. I was scared to do it. I was young. I wasn't sure how to really get started. But Michelle was a real inspiration. Like, you can do it. I believe in you. And she had started her own business a few years before I had met her, so just from that standpoint. But so I start my business, and I don't know, I was probably 5, 6 months into the business, and only about 6, 7 months into dating Michelle. Again, those two things sort of coincided. I called her up one day on the phone. I was really frustrated. And just feeling like, I don't know if I can do this. I'd had a couple things that hadn't gone well, and it just didn't seem like this was actually a good idea for me. I should, so I call her up. I said, I don't know if I can do this. I don't know if I have what it takes. This is really hard. This is really scary. People keep saying no. Maybe I'm too young. Maybe I just don't have, and on and on. And then I just started, it's like, I'm a loser. This was stupid, right? You ever have those moments, right? It sort of went from bad to worse. And Michelle's great. She's a great listener, lots of empathy, lots of compassion. One of the many things I love about her. And she listened to me for a while on the phone, and then she said, okay. She said, first of all, thank you for calling, and I appreciate you being willing to be open and real and honest with me. She said, second, though, I need to say something to you, and I need you to listen. And I said, what? She said, stop talking about my boyfriend like that. I said, what? She said, look, I know you're upset, and I understand, but you just said some really mean things about yourself. And if someone else said those things about you, I would be upset with them. Right? I would defend you. I love you. And she said, just because you're you doesn't give you the right to say those things about yourself. My first reaction was, man, I like this woman, right? But then as I thought about it more, I had never thought about it in that context. Wow. She really does love and care about me. I'm important to her. And it wasn't like my ego that felt good about that. It was more just like I really got that. And I realized, wow, when I end up acting and doing things and saying things really negatively about myself, it's not only hurtful and painful and damaging to me, which it is, to her as well. And that's true for all of us. Whether it's a partner or a spouse or friends or family members or children or grandchildren or whoever, you're important in people's lives. Not like self-important, but like genuinely, authentically important. And when we remember that, it becomes less just about us. We know it's not good for us, it's not healthy for us to treat ourselves and talk to ourselves that way. However, when we take it outside of ourselves and realize, wow, there's a bunch of people around me that I really love and care about, and they really love and care about me, I don't want to consciously do anything that's going to hurt them or myself. I saw this great quote from Brene Brown on Facebook a few months ago. It said, talk to yourself as if you were talking to someone that you really love. Think about that. How do we talk to ourselves? How do we relate to ourselves? Right? And the thing that change involves, right? Some awareness, absolutely. But if we go about change from a critical place, from a judgmental place, it ends up really being motivated by shame. We're trying to change because we think something's wrong with us. That's not only not healthy, that's not sustainable. It doesn't really create lasting change if it's motivated by shame. Does that make sense? If it's motivated by love, it's a choice. I choose. I choose to change this aspect of myself because I want to be more of who I am. I choose to change this behavior because it doesn't really serve me. Not because I'm a bad, terrible person. It's because that doesn't serve me. And then in the process, we got to be able to forgive ourselves. You know, a big theme of this book that I wrote, Nothing Changes Until You Do, is self-compassion. And there was a woman, a professor named Kristen Neff, who I became familiar with. She's a professor at the University of the University of Texas in Austin. Brene Brown's a professor at the University of Houston. And Dr. Neff talks about self-compassion in a really interesting way. She studied it, like scientifically studied it, looked at it from a psychological perspective, but also looked at it, and the way I looked at it from a more spiritual perspective, there's 3 components to self-compassion. First of all, mindfulness, awareness. We have to notice and pay attention to, how am I actually relating to myself? What am I thinking about myself? What am I saying about myself? What are my affirmations, if you will, conscious, or even some of them not so conscious? So mindfulness is the first part. Second part has to do with kindness, actually being kind to ourselves. And for some of us, that's challenging, but we all know how to be kind. We know how to be kind to children. We know how to be kind to animals. We know how to be kindness is like, it's easy for us to access, sometimes not always for ourselves, but if we just access that part, being kind and loving to ourselves. So mindfulness, awareness, kindness, and then the third piece of it is common humanity. Meaning that my personal story of negativity, of self-criticism, actually isn't that personal. It's part of the human experience. We're not alone in it. It doesn't mean we have to then commiserate with each other, but we realize, oh, this isn't personal, this is just part of being human, but I don't have to get caught up in it. Does that make sense? So I'm aware, kind towards myself, and I realize this isn't personal. But sometimes what it takes for us to ultimately change, so we've been talking a little bit about removing that self-righteousness that we might have with other people, being kinder and gentler to ourselves, but change often involves risk. It involves risk, fundamentally. When we go to change anything, it's risky because we don't know exactly how it's going to turn out. We go up to the edge, wherever the edge is, and it's like, I want to change, I want to grow, I want something new and different. Uh-oh, what if I fall over the edge? What if it doesn't work out? What if it hurts? What if it doesn't go so well? So that's why it's so fundamental that we embrace vulnerability. Really embrace it. Not just understand it, but embrace it. And here's the funny thing about vulnerability. We have a very strange relationship with vulnerability. Here's what I mean by that. So I got invited to speak at an event in Japan a few months back by a company based here in the US, but they have people all over the world, and so they invited me to speak at this leadership conference in Japan, and I was excited. I've actually never been to Japan. I was excited. But what was going to be interesting about this particular event is I was going to be speaking to 300 people, none of whom speak English, all Japanese, right? So they were going to do what's called a simultaneous translation. You see this, right? You watch the United Nations and the president's speaking and everyone has a little thing in their ear and it's all being translated, right? So I've done this a handful of times, always a little challenging for me. First of all, I speak quickly. Second of all, I make lots of references to American things. And thirdly, I speak very extemporaneously, so I can't like hand them, here's an outline or a script, like they don't really know where it's going. So not easy for a translator to translate me, right? So anyway, I'm meeting with the translator before, and she's a little stressed out because I don't have like a big PowerPoint presentation to give her or an outline, and I'm trying to calm her down and say, it's going to be fine, it's going to be fine, I'll try to slow down. And she said, well, tell me some things you're going to talk about. And I'm telling her some things, and I said, well, one thing I'm going to focus on a lot is the importance of vulnerability. And she says, vulnerability? And I said, yeah, vulnerability. She says, vulnerability? I said, yeah, vulnerability. She said, there's no word for that in Japanese. I said, what? She said, well, there is a word, but it's a bad word. I said, like, well, what is it? And she said, it means weakness. I said, oh, no, it means the same thing in English. She said, why would you tell anyone to be vulnerable? And I said, well, first of all, what my experience has taught me, what my research has shown me, what I know to be true is that vulnerability is the key driver in human trust and connection. Natural response to vulnerability is empathy. I said, and secondly, now I was speaking to a group of leaders, so I was like, if they're going to build their relationships, vulnerability is essential. I said, but secondly, any change, any growth, any creativity, any innovation, anything, personally or collectively, involves vulnerability. We can't create anything new without, right? It's inherently vulnerable. She was not buying it. And at this point, I didn't know what else to do. And I said to her, look, you're clearly an expert on the culture. I'm not. You're clearly an expert on the language. I'm not. This may not make any sense at all, but do me a favor, translate what I say. If it doesn't make sense, I'll figure it out. I didn't know how I was going to figure it out, but at that point, I was sort of done having that conversation, right? Because it wasn't really going anywhere, and she's looking at me like I'm crazy. And now, I was already nervous. Now I'm more nervous, right? So I'm up there, I have an hour with this group, and I'm thinking, okay, and I got to the point where I'm talking about vulnerability, and I remember I looked in the little translating booth as I'm speaking, and I'm thinking, what is she telling them, right now? Don't listen to him, he's crazy, right? I have no idea, but whatever she was saying, they're hearing, and it seemed like it was resonating. And I got done with my presentation. It seemed like it went pretty well, but again, it was a little different than I'm used to speaking, so I wasn't quite sure. I got off stage, I walked to the back. Next person that got up to speak was speaking Japanese, so he didn't need translation. Woman gets out of the little translating booth, walks across the back of the ballroom over to me, and she says, thank you for your presentation. I said, you're welcome. She said, I didn't understand what you meant earlier when we were talking about vulnerability, but I think I understand now. She said, vulnerability is not bad. It's just hard. I said, you're right. It's hard. It's scary. We don't want to get hurt. We don't want to fall down. We don't want to damage ourselves or other people. Of course, it's uncomfortable. And we've all had experiences where we've been hurt or disappointed or let down or failed miserably. It's life, though, right? It's what it takes. We want change, we want growth, we want something new, we want something different. It's not always pretty, it's not always perfect, never is, right? It twists and turns and ebbs and flows, and in the moment it doesn't make sense all the time. But it's that faith, it's that trust, right? Does that make sense? All right, I got one last little story I want to share just as we wrap this up, but you see where this relates to your life? To your relationships, to areas where you want to change, for people you might want to change? Okay. Yeah, it's great to be here. Thanks for having me back. Again, I'm going to share one last little story, but how many of you ever listened to Hay House Radio? You know Hay House has a radio network? I have a show on Hay House Radio, if you ever listen to it. It's on Monday mornings at 9 o'clock tomorrow, actually. So if you listen, call in. It's fun. I do it from my office, and I'm always wondering, is anybody actually listening? But this last story I want to share is just, again, when you think about change, we think about that vulnerability, we think about that place, you know. I write a lot in my most recent book about my mom because my mom had passed away in the summer of 2011, and I wrote the book about a year and a half, 2 years later, but it had a huge impact on me, obviously. But again, of the many blessings, there was another real blessing that I got. She taught me so much throughout life and through our relationship, but even through her death. And there was a moment that I had about a month or so before she died that was really profound for me. I had spent the night at my mom's house in Oakland. I grew up in Oakland. They bought that house. My parents bought that house when my mom was pregnant with me. So it was the only house that I'd ever known and grown up in. And so my mom's getting pretty sick. it had happened pretty quickly. And so the reality of what was happening was really starting to set in. And I'd been in the house with her and spent the night and been trying to help her out. And as you can imagine, I was pretty emotional. There was a lot going on. But I get up that morning and I go out to go for a run in the neighborhood. And I'm out running. And I'm listening to some music. And I'm just trying to like clear my mind a little and just try to be present with everything that's going on. But lots of emotions running through me. And I'm running up and down the hills that I literally like rode my big wheel on when I was a kid, right? So I'm having all these memories and I'm remembering myself in different times and my bike and my friends and falling down and playing baseball and all this stuff is flooding back to me and I'm thinking about my mom and I start to have this conversation in my head and I start to think, man, I wonder what it's like for my mother right now. Like we've been talking and having all these beautiful conversations, but what's it like for her right now knowing that she's gonna die? Like what must that feel like? And then as soon as I thought that, my very next thought was, wait a minute. I know I'm going to die. I just don't live like that. And it literally stopped me in my tracks. And I stopped running and I took my headphones off and I just sat and I looked around and I went, whoa. If I could live my life more aware of my own death in a healthy way, that would change the way that I live, fundamentally. The things I do or don't do, the things I say or don't say, the stuff I'm afraid to try, the stuff I'm worried that, like, who cares? So the question for all of us, that's the reality for all of us, however young or old we may be, however facing that moment or not we might be in practical terms, is can we stay present enough and open enough and aware enough to live like that? And ultimately remember that nothing changes until we do. Thanks for having me. Thank you.